what you're adding is a lot of very fine powder into a liquid that has a lot of carbon dioxide in solution, and it's escaping me right now what you're causing. I think it's
called nucleation. Nucleation sites.
Thank you. You're going to throw in 50 million nucleation points, and what you're going to get is what we refer to as an MEA.
Mead eruption accident.
Mead eruption accident, yes. And you're not ready. You're not ready to see one, and you don't want that to happen because you can lose half of your entire batch, and as my wife was going to kill me, spill a lot of honey water all over your wooden floor. And some people have said that they've even had the MEAs hit the ceiling if they're under a fruit cap or something and they build up some pressure. So you want to make sure that first you aerate, you stir it, you do whatever you need to do to get that CO2 out of there as much as possible, and then after you do that is when you add your nutrients, which have been dissolved in a little bit of must or a little bit of water first. Otherwise, everybody who's doing this for the first time, by the time you get to your fifth batch, you'll have had one of these, so you'll know what I'm talking about.
Well, anybody who's seen the Diet Coke and Mentos, it's a pretty good approximation.
Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, pretty spot on, actually, because that's exactly what you're doing with the Mentos. You're creating millions of nucleation points. Also, during your primary fermentation, that's when it's most important, although it's always important, but that's one of the times when it's really most important to make sure that your temperature is controlled. And if you can, this is a little bit more advanced. I don't think I ever did this before I made maybe my 10th batch, but checking your pH is really important to making sure that your batch stays on track, because if your pH goes too high, I believe, or too high or too low, it'll stress your yeast, and it'll cause sometimes the fermentation to completely stop. And always make sure, like AJ said before, whenever you do anything to your must, whenever you take a reading, anything that you stick in your must, always make sure that you sanitize it first. Otherwise, you're going to make a big bunch of vinegar. Hopefully, you'll be able to do all that stuff, and you'll get to your secondary, which AJ is going to tell us about. And then we can where we rack off the gross leads. AJ, can you take it away?
I will take it away. One other thing though about primary, before you add anything, degas. We didn't talk at all about degassing.
Degassing, that's what I said. That's what I meant to say. I mentally blocked there. Stir it.
Okay.
I said.
Yeah, the reason you want to stir it all the time is because as yeast is creating, it's eating sugar and creating alcohol, the other thing it creates is carbon dioxide, which is what comes out of your airlock. But it only starts coming out of your airlock once it has reached saturation point in your must. So your must is still full of carbon dioxide, which is toxic to your yeast, so you want to get it out of there as much as you can. It's just good for your yeast if you can get it out.
Right.
Right. So, secondary. The point at which you want to rack your must off of your primary fermentation is when either your specific gravity stops and hasn't moved for like a week, and you've decided you're not going to restart it if it's above 1, or it's hit about 1. Once it's hit 1.00, it's usually a good idea to rack it off the gross lees. And typically for me that involves taking a racking hose and siphoning it from the bucket that I do my primary fermentation into a glass carboy, which I will of course sanitize the hell out of. And sorry, I have not got my list in front of me. There we go. Sorry, Firefox was having a moment. Alright, so the reason you want to get your yeast off of the gross lees is because, or your mead off of the gross lees is because the yeast can eventually start to break down, and all of the stuff that they've absorbed out of your mead, they can release back into it, which may not be what you want in there. And also, there can be a fair amount of just stuff that, impurities in your honey or fruit bits if you used fruit, and you don't want it sitting around in that because it can create off flavors. So as soon as your fermentation is mostly done, you want to rack it off of the gross lees. And then that gives your yeast a quiet place to finish the last little bits of sugar in the must. At this point, you want to try to keep oxygen away from your must. Now, some people in secondary will rack onto fruit. We'll talk more about this when we get to our fruit episode. But I started as a winemaker, so for me, if I did not put my fruit in primary, I was going to be fermenting sugar water. So I haven't ever put fruit in secondary fermentation. But if you want a gentler, if you want the ferment to treat your fruit in a more gentle fashion, you can put your fruit in secondary. So you essentially make your traditional mead, and then when you rack it onto fruit. And then you're going to need to rack it off of that after a week or two. Typically, everything that's good that you're going to get out of fruit is out into your mead within about a week to 2 weeks. My general rule is I don't leave, with the exception of Joe's Ancient Orange or a variation on that theme, I almost never leave. A ferment on the fruit for longer than about 2 weeks, just because that's.
Yeah, they had said that I guess if you're racking onto fruit, it's because you want a more fruity taste versus a more winey taste or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never done it, so I don't know.
Yeah, we're going to have to get someone who has done that on when we do our fruit section. But yeah, typically there's a difference between wine and grape juice, and if you extrapolate that to primary and secondary fermentation, you can either ferment it and then what you've got is wine, or you can ferment what you've got and then add juice to it, which means it'll be more like adding juice to your wine, as opposed to just having fermented your juice into wine. That's kind of what the difference tastes like, as I understand. I don't know.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that, because when you rack onto fruit, you're racking yeast on there, and doesn't it just start right back up? I don't know. I guess.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you let your fermentation pretty much finish all the way, then a lot of the yeast, as they stop being as active as they were, will start settling out, and that's where a lot of the lees is inactive yeast. And as long as your yeast are really active, your must is going to stay cloudy. But as soon as your yeast start being less active, they will start sinking to the bottom because they're not expending as much energy and they're not wiggling around as much. So they'll settle out, and if you rack off of that, then you're using a lot less yeast. They'll still ferment what's in there a little bit, but I've even heard of people who will stabilize their wine and then or stabilize their mead and then rack it onto the fruit. So at that point, you really are just adding fruit juice because it's not going to ferment at all.
True. Okay.
So, sorry. I mean, there's no one way of doing anything. There's just a whole bunch of best practices for most situations.
Right.
So let's see, racking. Yeah, you want to rack off the gross lees, and when you've got your stuff racked into secondary, you want to keep an eye on it. You want to make sure your airlock is well fitted and not letting out oxygen in. You want to make sure that you keep your airlock full, unlike what I have been doing lately and letting them go dry. I am the bad example. Don't do what I do. Do as I say, not as I do. So there may be a small amount of airlock activity at this point. Now, sometimes racking off the lees will cause your ferment to stop, usually when you don't want it to, and sometimes just agitating it a little bit will make it start going again, especially when you don't want it to, because yeast are ornery and they're just like that. They'll never do exactly what you want when you want them to do it, so...
Right. I think it's important to note that again. I mean, during your primary fermentation, especially at the very, very beginning, you want to get oxygen in there as much as possible. But when you're racking off your gross lees into secondary, oxygen is your enemy. You want to keep it away as much as possible.
Yeah, because your oxygen in the first half is fine because your yeast are using it as they're building up their colony and they're doing their thing. But after about halfway, then oxygen, as you said, becomes the enemy, and it will damage your wine. Anybody who's ever had sherry, that particular flavor of sherry, that's oxidation. So if you have a wine that sort of tastes like it's gone a little bit like sherry, you've had oxidation. Now, it is considered a fault in competition, but personally I've found there's a couple of batches I've had where I'm glad it did oxidize a little bit, because it actually improved the flavor, in my opinion. But in most cases, like that, it can also, instead of going like sherry, it can go like wet cardboard, and I've had that happen once or twice too, when I've had an airlock go dry on me, or I left way too much headspace in a batch. And that is really not pleasant, and there's really no way to fix it. So you don't want to do that. Now, we call it primary and secondary, even though secondary can actually be more than one phase. So I'm going to call the rest of this tertiary and subsequent rackings. As the lees accumulate, and if you've got fruit in there, as your fruit pales, you want to keep racking it. And every time you get maybe a quarter inch of buildup, you want to rack it again. It really depends on what you've made. Every must is different, but some will keep dropping sediment for friggin' ever, and some of them will pretty much drop clear, and then, you know, you can leave them sitting for and aging for a year, and they won't drop anything else. But
mention drop gravity. They'll keep some dropping gravity.
Again, every batch is different.
Yeah.
Some of them will drop gravity a little bit, and you know, you want to make sure that it has completely stopped dropping gravity before you bottle it. And if you've got any residual sugar at all, i.e. if your mead is anywhere up to or above 1.00, you definitely want to stabilize it before you bottle it, or leave it to age for a couple of years. Otherwise, you risk bottle bombs. Mm-hmm. But let's see, before we get to bottling, there's a lot of little particulates in your mead, and it's recommended that you stir your mead every day, even after you're no longer incorporating oxygen. It's recommended that you stir it, going back to primary, I'm a little bit disorganized here, sorry. You want to stir it every day to keep the yeast in suspension so that they're not all settling down to the bottom, because you want them to keep doing their job. And then in secondary, you want to let them settle out a little bit before you rack them. So, but the thing is, stirring it early brings all of the large particles into contact with more of the small particles that you're going to want to have settled out of your mead eventually. And you wouldn't think stirring it up so that it's all cloudy is actually going to help make it clear later, but it does. Because what you're doing by stirring it up is making all of the particles agitate and more likely to stick to each other. And the bigger a particle is, the faster it settles out. So the more contact all of the little particles in your mead have with each other, the more likely they are to stick together and settle out quicker. So stirring it up actually can make it clearer, as much as that is totally counterintuitive. And when you get to a point where you want to start thinking about bottling your wine or your mead and it's not clear and you want it to clear up, there's a couple of things you can do. The first one I always try is fining it. I'll start with bentonite. There typically are two types of particles that can be floating around suspended in your mead. Some of them are positively charged, some of them are negatively charged. And I know bentonite will attract one and sparkleoid will attract the other. I always start with bentonite because all you have to do is mix it with water, let it sit for a bit so it absorbs the water properly, and then pour it in, stir it up, and wait a week. Sparkaloid, you actually have to heat that up. And so I always start with bentonite, and that'll take